The moment I set the pen down on that conference table, the room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioning hum. My brother had flown in from Phoenix specifically for this, 1,700 miles, first class, with his wife and their matching Louis Vuitton carry-ons. He'd booked a suite at the Marriott downtown, the nice one. The one with the rooftop bar. He had come prepared to celebrate. He just hadn't prepared for me to say no. "Sign it, Audrey." His voice was soft, the way a threat is soft. Not loud. Not yet. This is a family decision. We already voted. I looked at the document in front of me. 43 pages. A transfer of deed, a dissolution of my ownership stake in the property my grandfather had left to me specifically. Not to the family, not split among siblings, not held in trust. To me, by name, because he wanted it that way. I pushed the pen toward the center of the table. "I'm not signing." That was when my sister-in-law stood up. I had never liked her. Not since the Christmas she told me, with a smile so sweet it could rot teeth, that it was so brave of me to still be renting at my age. I was 28. She was 31 and living in a house my brother had bought entirely with money our grandfather lent him. Money that was never repaid. Money that conveniently disappeared from conversation whenever anyone mentioned the estate. She placed both hands flat on the table and leaned forward. "You are being incredibly selfish right now. Do you understand what you're doing to this family?" I understood perfectly. I want to back up. Because this story doesn't start in that conference room. It starts about 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday in October, when my grandfather called me from his landline. He still had a landline, still have the same number he'd had since 1987, and asked me to come visit. I drove up that weekend. He was 81, sharp as a tack, still doing his own grocery shopping and beating the neighbors at bridge on Thursday nights. He made coffee and we sat in the kitchen the way we always had, at the same table with the same slightly wobbly chair that nobody ever fixed. And he told me he'd been thinking. "I've redone the will," he said. "I want you to know about it before anything happens." He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Not the legal document, just a handwritten summary, his looping cursive covering one side of a yellow legal pad sheet. He went through it line by line. He explained why. He told me that he'd watched me work since I was 16, that he'd seen me put myself through college while my brother coasted on loans from him, that he'd watched me build something real while everyone else held out their hand. The house, a 3-bedroom Craftsman on 2 acres 40 minutes outside of Portland, was to come to me. "Your brother's going to be upset," he said. He wasn't asking. I know. That's why I'm telling you now, so you're not blindsided. He died in February. Quietly in his sleep, the way everyone hopes for. I got the call at 6:14 in the morning, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before I could make myself stand up. The will was read 3 weeks later, and my grandfather had been right. My brother was upset. He didn't say anything at the attorney's office. He sat with his jaw tight and his hands folded on the table, and he said almost nothing the entire time. His wife cried. Not sad crying. The other kind, the performative kind, the kind designed to make everyone in the room look at her. My mother kept touching her arm and murmuring things I couldn't hear. I drove home alone. I thought maybe that was the end of it. I was naive. The call started the following week. First it was my mother, reasonable at first, asking if I'd thought about what this means for everyone, as if my grandfather's clearly stated wishes were somehow a problem I had created. Then it escalated. My brother called and told me that grandfather had obviously not been thinking clearly in his final years, that the house was a family asset, that I was being greedy and cruel. I am a licensed CPA. I have worked in estate accounting for 6 years. I know exactly what not thinking clearly means in a legal context, and I know exactly what evidence that claim requires. My grandfather had been assessed by his physician quarterly. His cognitive function was documented as entirely intact up to 3 months before his death. I knew this because I had been the one who drove him to those appointments. I told my brother this. He didn't want to hear it. By April they had hired an attorney. I want to be very clear about something. I did not want to fight. I had spent my entire adult life trying not to fight with my family. I had swallowed things I shouldn't have swallowed. laughed at things that weren't funny, driven 4 hours round trip for holidays I didn't want to attend, because keeping the peace felt like a moral obligation. I had watched my brother borrow money and never mention it again. I had listened to my sister-in-law make comments about my apartment, my job, my relationship status, my clothing. I had smiled and changed the subject and told myself that family was complicated and that was just how things were. I was done. I called my own attorney. I called the estate attorney who had drafted my grandfather's will. I gathered every document I had, the will itself, the physician's assessments, the letter my grandfather had written me in his own hand, and left with his attorney to be delivered after his death. I hadn't known about the letter until the estate attorney handed it to me at the reading. I had cried in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. In the letter, my grandfather said he'd watched me become someone he was proud of. He said he hoped the house would give me roots. He said he was sorry that giving me something real would cause trouble, but that he trusted me to hold steady. I made a copy of everything. I gave one set to my attorney. I kept one set to my attorney. I kept one set in a fireproof box in my closet. My brother's attorney sent a letter in May arguing undue influence, the claim that I had somehow manipulated a dying old man into changing his will. I found this almost funny given that I lived 3 hours away and had visited my grandfather roughly once a month, while my brother had visited twice in the last 2 years of his life. Both times around Christmas, when the whole family was present. I had the visitor logs from his assisted care physician's office. I had receipts from grocery runs I'd done for him, coffee shop visits, the hardware store where we'd gone together to pick out a new mailbox because his old one had rusted through. My attorney responded formally. The case did not have merit, but it kept going. By July, my mother had stopped speaking to me except through texts. By August, my brother had posted something on Facebook, vague enough to have deniability, specific enough that every family member knew exactly who he was talking about people who put themselves above family. I didn't respond. I screenshotted it and sent it to my attorney. Then in September they proposed mediation. The idea was that we would meet with a neutral third party, a mediator, and reach a family agreement about the property. I knew what this meant. It meant they wanted me in a room where I could be pressured without a judge present, where the mediation itself, framed as reasonable and collaborative, could be used to make me look unreasonable and hostile if I refused to give ground. I agreed to attend. My attorney came with me. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and had the specific kind of 3 a.m. conversation with myself, where you question every decision you've ever made. Was I being stubborn? Was the house worth this? My grandfather wanted me to have roots. Would he have wanted me to have them at the cost of my entire family? I thought about the letter. I thought about what he'd written. I trust you to hold steady. I got up at 5 and made coffee and sat with the letter for a long time. The mediation was held in a neutral office downtown, one of those conference rooms that exists specifically to feel like nobody's territory. Gray carpet, a long table, a credenza with a water pitcher and glasses. My brother arrived with his wife and their attorney. My mother was there. She looked at me when I walked in and then looked away. I sat down. My attorney sat beside me. I placed my folder on the table and folded my hands on top of it. The mediator introduced herself. She explained the process. My brother's attorney spoke first, and for about 20 minutes, he presented a version of events that I barely recognized, a version in which my grandfather had been isolated and confused, in which I had been his primary caretaker in ways that gave me outsized influence, in which the other grandchildren had been systematically excluded from his affections in his final years. I listened. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. When it was my turn, I did not get emotional. I had promised myself I wouldn't. I opened my folder. I went through the physician's assessments, one by one. I noted the dates, the findings, the attending physician's name and credentials. I went through my grandfather's own documented statements, the will, drafted by his longtime estate attorney with no input from me, revised 18 months before his death when I was living in a different city and had no contact whatsoever with his attorney. I presented the visitor documentation. I presented my brother's own records. The 2 visits in 2 years, compared to my 20-some visits, all of which were documented through receipts, texts, and his physician's notes, where my name appeared as the accompanying family member. I looked at my brother when I finished. He was looking at the table. My grandfather knew what he wanted, I said. He wrote it down in his own hand in a letter he left with his attorney. He trusted me to hold steady. I intend to. My sister-in-law made a noise, a scoff, barely audible, the kind of sound designed to signal contempt without being explicitly rude. My mother pressed her lips together. Then the mediator asked my brother's attorney if he had any response to the documentation I'd presented. There was a pause. "We'd need time to review," he began. "You've had 4 months," my attorney said pleasantly. Another pause. A longer one. My brother looked up. For the first time since we'd walked in, he looked directly at me, and what I saw in his face wasn't anger anymore. It was something else. Something closer to the look he used to give me when we were kids, and he'd pushed something too far and knew it. "This doesn't have to be this way," he said. His voice was different now. Quieter. We could work something out. You could buy us out. A partial interest. Something. I had anticipated this. My attorney and I had discussed it. There was a version of me, the version that had spent 30 years trying to keep the peace, that might have said yes, that might have written a check just to make it stop. "No," I said. "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because it's not what he wanted, and I'm not going to undo what he decided just because it's inconvenient for you." My sister-in-law opened her mouth. My mother put a hand on her arm. The mediator asked if anyone needed a break. Nobody said yes. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. We did not reach an agreement that day. But something shifted. My brother's attorney formally withdrew the undue influence claim 6 weeks later. The case was over. I drove up to the house for the first time as its legal owner on a Saturday in November. I had the keys already. The estate attorney had given them to me after the will was settled. But I hadn't gone yet. It hadn't felt right to go until it was truly finished. I unlocked the front door and stood in the entry for a moment, just looking. The house smelled like him. That specific combination of cedar and old books, and the particular coffee he always ordered from a small shop in town, the kind that came in a brown paper bag with the name handwritten on the label. The furniture was still there. His reading chair was still angled toward the window, toward the yard, where the maple tree he planted 30 years ago had grown into something enormous and red in the November light. I sat down in his chair. I don't have a neat lesson to wrap this up with. I don't have a piece of wisdom that makes all of it feel worth it. The months of legal letters, the unanswered texts, the particular grief of watching your family become people you don't recognize. I have a house. I have 2 acres outside of Portland and a wobbly kitchen chair and a maple tree that turns every shade of red in the fall. I have a letter in a fireproof box that says, "I trust you to hold steady." My brother and I don't speak. My mother and I text occasionally, functional things, logistics, the kind of communication that keeps a door technically open without either of us having to walk through it. My sister-in-law has me blocked everywhere, which I consider honestly a gift. I moved in 6 months ago. I painted the kitchen a shade of green, my grandfather would have called ridiculous, and I love it. I fixed the wobbly chair myself. I have learned where all the drafts come from and which windows stick in the humidity and how the light moves through the living room in the late afternoon in a way that makes the whole place feel like it's breathing. I held steady. He knew I would. Some days that is enough. Most days, actually, it is more than enough. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that conference room. Not the legal outcome. That part is clean, documented, final. I mean what happened underneath it. Why it went the way it did. My brother is not a stupid man. He knew the will was valid. His attorney knew it too. That's why they dropped the claim. What they were counting on wasn't a legal victory. It was exhaustion. They were betting that I would get tired, that the cost of holding on, the silence from my mother, the months of letters, the particular loneliness of being the one person in your family that everyone else has decided is the problem, would eventually outweigh the thing I was holding on to. A lot of people would have made that calculation and let go. I almost did. What stopped me wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't even the house itself, really. It was something my grandfather understood about me before I fully understood it about myself. That I had spent too many years making myself smaller so other people could feel more comfortable. And that there is a point where that stops being generosity and starts being erasure. The documentation I brought to that mediation table wasn't just evidence, it was the record of who I actually was in my grandfather's life. 20-some visits, grocery runs and hardware store trips, and sitting in that kitchen with the wobbly chair, while my brother showed up twice in 2 years and then stood in a conference room and called me manipulative. The record didn't lie. That's the thing about living honestly over time, it accumulates. You can't fake 20 receipts in a physician's log. You can only have them if they're real. I think about cause and effect a lot now, not in a cosmic sense. I don't believe the universe was keeping score. But I do believe that the choices you make consistently, over years, without an audience, without any immediate reward, become the thing that saves you when something is actually at stake. I had driven those hours because I wanted to. I had shown up because I loved him. That was the whole reason. And then, when my family tried to rewrite what that meant, I had the receipts, literally, to prove them wrong. There's a version of this story where I sign the document to keep the peace, where I convince myself it's the mature thing, the gracious thing, the thing that keeps the family intact. I understand that version. I was very close to it. But I've come to believe that peace, bought by abandoning what's true, isn't peace. It's just a quieter kind of losing. I held steady, not because I was brave, I was scared for most of it, but because my grandfather told me he trusted me too, and I had decided, sometime between that October phone call and that November morning when I sat in his chair for the first time as its owner, that I was not going to be someone who let that trust down. The house is mine. The maple tree turns red every fall. That's enough. That's more than enough.